Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
For most Indians, Lal Bahadur Shastri is the Prime Minister who got lost between Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi. It's one of the great what-if stories of Indian politics. What if Lal Bahadur Shastri had not died suddenly after signing that treaty with Pakistan in Tashkent? How would India's history have been different? Perhaps Indira Gandhi might never have become Prime Minister at all. Now Lal Bahadur Shastri is mostly remembered as a sort of odd footnote of history. Whenever a terrible railway accident happens, some commentator brings up the story of how Rail Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri resigned after taking moral responsibility. He became a sort of exemplar of morality and probity in Indian politics, the man who gave India the slogan, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. Yet in the 50s, few thought this small, unassuming man from a very humble background might become a successor to the very cosmopolitan, larger-than-life Nehru. How did he become the second Prime Minister of India? It was because he was a great conciliator, says the new biography of the man. It's called The Great Conciliator, Lal Bahadur Shastri and the Transformation of India. The author is IAS officer Sanjeev Chopra, who was fittingly the director of the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy of Administration in Mussoorie. Sanjeev Chopra, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sandeep. It's a pleasure to be with you.
The first thing I learned from your book that really surprised me is Lal Bahadur Shastri's name is not actually Lal Bahadur Shastri. He wasn't actually Shastri. Tell us about that.
No, he was not a Shastri. He was actually born Lal Bahadur Verma, but he dropped his Verma title in school itself. And Shastri is the sort of honor, the sort of title which was given after 4 years of his studies at the Kashi Vidyapith, which he did because Mahatma Gandhi had asked him all to leave the government school and government institution. Incidentally, BHU was also a government-recognized institution. Therefore, straight after his, and in fact, before completing his matriculation, he had decided to give up studies in a government institution. And that's how he joined the Kashi Vidyapith. And there, after 4 years of studies, he got the Upadhi of Shastri. So that's how he got the name Shastri. And then, of course, Shastri has now been adopted as the title by his family members.
And he dropped Verma as a boy because he didn't want the caste indications, or what was that?
It's difficult to envisage at this stage what led him to, but probably that must have been the reason, because not much is written about it, except that, his mama with whom he was staying, he was also not using Verma as a title. And it didn't lead to a lot of protest within the household. So I think it was perhaps a progressive caste household.
Now, you were the director of the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration. Beyond the name, how much of him is preserved there?
Not as much as ought to have been. You see, two very important things are there. One is, you see that what the Academy's emblem is, Sheelam Param Bhushanam. That, of course, is drawn from Lal Bahadur Shastri. Yoga Karmasu Kaushalam, this is also drawn from Lal Bahadur Shastri. And one thing was that, you see, because his secretary, Rajeshwar Prasad, was the director of the Academy when this transition took place, when he got these things added. So because it was the National Academy of Administration, when Rajeshwar Prasad in the mid-70s became the director, the name was changed to the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration. And the IAS got Yoga Karmasu Kaushalam and Sheelam Param Bhushanam. So, the Academy was a very anglicized place, as I must put it, till the name Lal Bahadur Shastri was added. It still continues to retain some of the old elements, because ultimately the Academy is the faculty and the officer trainings, right? So from the pipe smoking, directors like, A.N. Jha and Putka, there has been a gradual change. And the change is reflective of the overall change in society. So just to think that because the name Lal Bahadur Shastri was added, there was a sudden change in the academy, no, that's not true. And I think we ought to be giving even more emphasis on the life of Lal Bahadur Shastri, which is happening. It's a slow process.
Of the many ways to describe Lal Bahadur Shastri, you chose the title Great Conciliator for the title of the book. Why that?
You see, that is because going through his life, I found that, he was a person who would always try to appreciate all different points of views that were around. Unlike Nehru, who had a very clear ideological dispensation that this is the way it should be. Lohia had a very clear idea what this is the way and that's the way it should be. Purushottam Das Tandon also had a very clear idea that, for instance, Purushottam Das Tandon would do anything for Hindi. He was so passionately convinced about, making Hindi the national language. There was no compromise in that situation. Again, Nehru was so clear about socialism. He wanted to collectivize farming also. So to that extent, Shastri did not have any one very clear ideological dispensation. He was willing to listen to all points of view, many different points of view, and then try to come to a consensus. In fact, if we look at it, you see, one of the first things which I noticed was, in the book, I've used the word Amma for his wife and Ammaji for his mother because everybody was called Amma those days. So I had to make this little distinction. Now, you see, his mother was so conservative in a loving way. I mean, she was very fond of Shastri. She gave him all the freedom, but she was very conservative. I mean, she, for instance, was very conscious of her caste, was not willing to, have interdining with Muslims, was not willing to let own Bahu take part in the political protests, things which Shastri wanted his wife to be involved in. I mean, he was very clear that Lalitaji must have a personality of her own. So he had to maintain a very fine balance. Maintaining a very fine balance between your mother and your wife is one great act of conciliation. So, in fact, how did he do it? He realized that he won't be able to convince his mother about Lalita Shastri's participation in picketing. So he told Kamala Nehru, he said that if you tell my mother, then my mother won't be able to say no to you. Now, here is a classic case of a person who knows how to get his things done, but without entering into confrontation.
Is there any modern politician who you could say is close to Lal Bahadur Shastri in that respect?
I will really have to jog my mind on that, and you'll have to call me after a few days, but because people I've met and people I've worked with in recent times, I would say perhaps Narayan Dutt Tiwari was closest to him. But then the moral compass which Shastri had is not the moral compass in which I would place Mr. Tiwari. Now, but having said that, I would say that Mr. Tiwari was a great administrator, was able to reconcile a lot of views. But when it came to probity in public life or when it came to other aspects, no one has ever accused Mr. Shastri of lack of probity in public life. And the simplicity with which he lived was, of course, very different. I've worked in Bengal for a long time. I did not see this in Buddhadev Bhattacharya. I did not see this in Jyoti Pashu. This ability of reconciling opinions, one can notice in Mr. Sharad Pawar also. But again, there were many other areas in which he was so very different.
What about, I know you read when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh died, you in your sort of tribute to him, you described him as unassuming, erudite, soft-spoken and a consensus builder. Those seem to also apply to Lal Bahadur Shastri?
No, but you see, there is one major difference. There's one major difference was that, Mr. Manmohan Singh, all respect to him, did not take decisive action. At the points of time when he had to take decisive action, he failed those opportunities. When Mr. Rahul Gandhi tore up the bill, the ordinance, that was the point when he should have resigned. And if he had resigned at that point of time, the way we look at him today would have been very different. So the one very important difference that you notice between Mr. Shastri and all the rest is that he was so willing to give up any position. And he was not asked to resign as the railways minister, but he took moral responsibility and resigned and thereby set up a new moral compass. He was not asked to quit at Kamraj Plan, but he opted to quit at the time of Kamraj Plan. And at various points of time in his life, we find that the ability to not get attached. So he was, in that sense, a real Karam Yogi in the old sense of the term. And when we say Karam Yogi, it does not mean that he did not understand politics. He understood politics, but there is something called the dharma of politics. There is something called the Lakshman Rekha, that this is the line up to which your ambition will take you, but this is the line where your ambition must stop. He was a very principled person. I mean, I wish I had worked on him about 30 years ago. It would have been very different. So what happens is that wisdom sometimes dawns late in life. But I'm glad that I did this research when I could. Two more reasons, because, at least two people who worked with him, Brigadier Subjit Singh and Satpal. Satpal, unfortunately, died while I was doing this research. And the third is the senior journalist who was with him at Tashkent, Prem Prakashji, the co-founder of ANI. And I'm so glad that I did it, because 10 years from now, one would not have been able to meet anyone who had seen him in person. So being able to talk to people who had seen him in person, who had interacted with him in person is very important. So I'm so glad that, and all of them are in their 90s, right? So God give them all a century of life. But, the fact is that anyone following me, say in the year 2035, if somebody had wanted to write this book, all of it would have been from secondary sources.
Right. While you were talking, I was thinking perhaps the one who nowadays, when the mediator in chief in the world seems to be Donald Trump. He's the one who's mediating between India and Pakistan. I just saw a meme saying Donald Trump will now mediate between Lalu Prasad Yadav and his eldest son. But it's a very different kind of mediation than Shastri, because I feel the primary difference is ego.
Yeah. You see, also, I think, Sandeep, one thing is, that all people who started their political career as part of the freedom movement, and that I would say, irrespective of the ideology they were following. I mean, they could have been communist leaders like Jyoti Basu, they could have been people in the Congress like Narayan Dutt Tiwari, they could have been people in the BJP who started their career in the freedom movement. But, the intent of getting into politics was the intent to get freedom for the country. And the person who's joining politics post-independence, especially in the post-1991 era, where market is the most dominant force, there the entire orientation is very different. I would say that in the 70s or the 80s, people who were participating in the student union movements, the orientation was very different. It was not market-driven. It was driven by a cause. It was driven by whatever ideological disposition. I would say that I would respect all ideological dispositions, because the intent is not market-driven. When the intent of joining politics is market-driven, then the entire orientation, then the entire thing changes so completely.
Yeah, because when you look at, and you spent a lot of time looking at Lal Bahadur Shastri's early years, his childhood, his education, early political activities, things which we didn't know very much about, because most of us know him from his time as Prime Minister. What about his growing up and his background, would you say, shaped that aspect of him to be a conciliator, to listen to all sides?
One, of course, is mother, and the fact that he grew up in extreme poverty, which meant that, he had to learn to not offend anyone. Many of us have had privileged childhoods. You assert your rights in your house. You see, he always understood that he does not have too many rights in whichever household he was living in. It was his mama badi. Mama, affectionate mama, but it was still mama badi. He couldn't claim that sort of a position. And the person he was staying with in Benares was actually his mother's cousin's husband. He was his cousin Mosaji, affectionate person, good. But, you don't have that sense of ownership. And I think, so that is something which could have made an impact on his life. That is one. Second, his first teacher, Nishkameshwar Mishra, who happened to be his scout teacher, who happened to be his English teacher, he had a profound influence on his life. He would narrate stories. So the entire narrative of being a Bharatiya, of being able to respect your own languages, respecting other things, that was very important. Now, you must also understand that that was the time when he was introduced to Tehzeeb also, because, learning Urdu, knowing Urdu was very important. He was introduced to the Brahminic tradition also. He was introduced to the Janeu ceremony also. And his teacher was an English teacher. His mama was also an English teacher. His grandfather had also been a teacher. So in many ways, he got the best of all the worlds. So he got, his written English is superb. Of course, English was not spoken at the house. So obviously, spoken English would not have been so great. In fact, Rajeshwar Prasad says that, it was so difficult to make a draft because you'd always find a mistake. That, I think that inbuilt attitude of, of being a teacher's ward. In fact, because I started off as a sub-editor in the Economic Times and Times of India, I also find, I find it so easy to find mistakes, so easy to find anything that's going wrong, because that's part of your training. But Nishkameshwar Mishra was a very important influence on him. I think moving to Kashi Vidyapith, which was a very different experience, because Kashi Vidyapith, the pedagogy was more interactive. It was, it was not a very formal syllabus, so they were expected to read, write, discuss. And in Dr. Bhagwan Das, he found a absolutely towering intellectual. So if you see the works of Dr. Bhagwan Das, especially the Essential Unity of All Religions, the Swaraj Manifesto, which he wrote with C.R. Das, so all the things which, and Bhagwan Das himself had worked with Annie Besant, had worked, was very extensive in his readings of Persian and Sanskrit, and to some extent had working knowledge of Hebrew as well. So these were the influences on him. Kashi Vidyapith, and then part of the work of Kashi Vidyapith students was to go and promote khadi in the afternoons, to have their own livelihood, to live in a mess, to cook their own food. I think all these were shaping his personality. And then to top it all, he started working with Lala Lajpat Rai. The Lajpat Rai was a very iconic figure of his time. I mean, one would say that till Mahatma Gandhi came on the scene, Lal Bal Pal were the most important people. And in their own respective geographies, there was nobody stronger than Tilak in the West, or, Bipin Chandra Pal in the East, or Lala Lajpat Rai in the North. So because he got the chance of working with Lala Lajpat Rai in a very different geography, and if you look at it, now compare Benares and Lahore. Benares is India's most traditional city. And then you go to Lahore, which is the most modern city. So Lahore and Calcutta are actually vying with each other to be India's most modern city. And perhaps Lahore was perhaps a notch better than Calcutta. I mean, you're
not allowed to say that on this show. I'm kidding.
No, but it has to be, you're from Calcutta and I trace my roots to Lahore. But anyway, the essential point is that Lahore was very different from Benares, right? And in Lahore, again, he got access to that Dwarkadas library. Very eclectic reading. So I think one of the things of those days was that people were reading a lot. And so all the classics, all of Marx, all of Hegel, all of Sankar, all of Ram Tirath, all of Vivekananda. He was reading Vivekananda also, he was reading Swami Ram Tirath also, and he was reading Harold Lasky also. So I think all this made a strong impact on his mind. And then Lala Lajpat Rai asked him to work on untouchability eradication in Meerut and Muzaffarnagar. So I think this trajectory of his experiences in the very first few years of his life, late teens, early 20s, I think that made a lot of difference to him. Now, this is a very different background from the background of, say, Jawaharlal Nehru, or, say, other people who were Shastris with them. I mean, very different from, say, the trajectory of Kamalapati Tripathi or of Algu Rai Shastri, who remained confined to one particular geography. So when you move out of a particular geography and move into very varied geographies, I think the way you think there's an evolution of your thought as it happens.
All these influences, him reading Vivekananda, he's reading Marx, all of that one understands. What I was very surprised is that the only book he writes, and he writes it, works on it while in prison, is in Hindi about Marie Curie.
Yes.
Did you find out why he was interested in her?
No, I think, he was so impressed with her, one, because, he had in his mind a certain idea about a European lady. In fact, most Indians had only seen the Mem Sahib. They'd only seen the Mem Sahib as the collector's wife, or they had seen her in the dance bar. So the notion of what a European woman was essentially one who's only concerned with the external world. In Marie Curie, he found a scientist. In Marie Curie, he found a person who was a profound thinker. In Marie Curie, he found a person who was patriotic, who was nationalistic, who had a scientific temper, and who had broken so many glass ceilings in that age. And that's why I was so impressed with her. I think another reason was that, perhaps this is a book that he came across in jail. Because in all jails, there would be a limited range of books. I would have this feeling that this book was available in the library, and therefore he picked it up, and therefore he read it. And when he read it, he felt that it was such a strong book that he needs to translate it so that there's a wider audience. And he also shortened it. He also reduced it. He got the pages to be more concise so that it becomes a simple, easy read, for everyone.
Maybe because he read that book and was so inspired by how she broke glass ceilings, yes. Perhaps that influenced him when years later as a minister, he recruits women as bus conductors, which had never been done.
Never been done, 1948, 49. So I think this is very important. The other aspect about his life is that everything that he did and said was based on some empirical fact. Everything that he writes on land reforms or the agrarian crisis, I think that's a very important book. The Agrarian Commission report of the Congress That's a remarkable PhD thesis. I mean, you read it, you get to understand everything about tenancy. I mean, I only wish it was, one had read it much earlier. In fact, even the credit which D. Bandyopadhyay and all the others claim on the West Bengal land reforms, right, a lot of it would be traced back to the Congress Agrarian Commission report because there has been no comprehensive critical examination of the problem with possible solutions. In fact, everything that we see today, whether it is Mahatma Gandhi in Narega, whether it is the CSCP, whether it is the FCI, whether it is the NFED, all of them, I find their genesis in this Congress Agrarian Commission report.
Wow. Can you talk a bit about how his stints in jail shaped him? Because one thing is clear, as you said, he came from a fairly poor family, unlike Nehru. So when he went to jail, it really meant economically very hard times for the family. You write about how there's a period when the family is only surviving on bhauri, which is just wheat flour kneaded with some salt and roasted. That's all they could afford to eat.
The most critical financial period for him was the 3-year period from 42 to 45. That was the most critical period, and perhaps he was not even aware of how difficult the family situation was. Because in all the other periods, I mean, the jail terms were 6 months, 1 year, 6 months, 1 year, and the SOPS had not been banned. The Congress had not been banned. So when the Congress was not banned or when the Servants of People's Society was not banned, I mean, there was something happening to the family. But it was the last one, the 42 to 45 after the Quit India movement, that Congress was declared illegal. And when Congress was declared illegal, that was the real crisis for the family. In fact, we've seen how Lalitaji was also down with tuberculosis. I mean, all the children were in a very bad shape. So that is one aspect. But he had sort of reconciled to the fact that, yes, there will be economic hardships. But, let's talk about all his jail terms. The first time he was treated as a C-class prisoner. The interesting point to note is that normally one would assume that when your status is shifted from a C class to a B class, you will be very excited about it. There is no reference to the change of his status from a C class prisoner to a B class prisoner in his correspondence with his mother. The other thing is to see that this is something which I picked up from Dharti Ke Lal, his snippets about his life in jail. They were treated, they were tied to the plow like oxen, to grind the mustard, to get the oil out. And there's one instance when he was given a very tight slap by a warder because it stopped to, take a breath. And all hell broke loose because this was something which was, beyond even those, shook the conscience of probably everyone. But he said that, look, we have taken the pledge of non-violence. And accepting this is also okay because our colleagues have suffered. Imagine the impact it would have on the warder. Imagine the impact this has on the superintendent. The superintendent is feeling that, look, something wrong has happened, but he says, okay, it's part of, A second, is when his daughter, Manju, she is on a deathbed virtually, and they want him to sign the letter saying that I'll take parole for up to a month, but I will not take part in political activities. He says, no, I can't do that. I cannot promise that I'll not take part in political activities, but then the district magistrate who knows him says, okay, I'm letting you off without this bond. And the day he reaches home, his daughter Manju dies. And he completes the rites and he goes back to jail. And everyone tells him that, look, you have a month. But he says, no, once I have the reason why I had taken this role, that reason no longer exists. So it won't be very fair on my part to, do this thing. Some other things happened. You see, once he was in jail, he realized that, and that's again something to do with current legislation. You see, they came to auction everything in his house because he refused to pay the fine. So they decided to take away the cots, the utensils, and anything that was in the house. So his wife, of course, was able to avoid the scene by saying that she's not Mrs. Shastri and he's not home. But, one of the first things which happened in the UP legislation was, and it still exists on the law today, that anything can happen, but cots and pans and utensils cannot be taken under any, even if you are declared, as a revenue defaulter. These are things which cannot happen. So I think all these were little instances of his life in jail, which impacted legislation. This correspondence that we see in jail shows him as a concerned father, shows him as a concerned son, shows him as a concerned relation. All these things are there. He wrote some very sensitive poems for his daughter he lost 2 daughters, right? Both when he was in jail. So, but equanimity is one aspect which one sees in him. Very, very important.
And you talk about the fact, as the Great Conciliator, that he is able to get along with people of very opposing points of view. So, for example, Jawaharlal Nehru, very cosmopolitan, barrister, English educated, all of that. And as you mentioned, Purushottam Das Tandon, they are bitterly opposed to each other within the Congress.
Absolutely.
But he is on good terms with both.
With both.
Does that create problems for him? Because now it feels like in politics, if you're in that position, one side would want you to be their advocate.
There's one thing, Sandeep, we forget that the ecosystem of politics of the 40s is very different from the ecosystem of politics today. You see, Nehru and Tandon were opposed on many things, but as far as the larger goal is concerned, that the country must be free from the Britisher, I think on that they were together. You see, once you have a very large common enemy, then your minor problems get sorted. There was no denying the fact that India wanted complete independence, right? That dominion status was not acceptable. These are things on which both Nehru and Tandon were agreed on. What kind of role governance should have once India is free? Should India be on the path towards CPSU? Or should India be moving towards the more modern capitalist, path of America? What should be the policy towards China? Sardar Patel had a very clear view. Nehru had another view. What should be the role of the ICS? What should be the role of the IAS? Very different views. But till such time as the country was fighting for independence, these views these were not antagonistic contradictions at that time. These became more and more aggravated. And as the market economy grows, these problems will become even more aggravated. And that's true also for the opposition that was being faced by Nehru and the left was accusing them of one set of issues, that you are not taking care of this, that you must expand the 5-year plan, for example. And the right was saying that because of expanding this 5-year plan, you're leading to inflationary pressures.
So let's talk about how he becomes prime minister. Nehru, giant who has, dominated Indian politics for so long, has died. There are other contenders with bigger personalities, perhaps. There's Morarji Desai is there. Gulzarilal Nanda is senior to him. There's Jagjeevan Ram. How does this unassuming 5'2" man who is being called Little Sparrow emerge as a possible successor? When does his name emerge?
The Little Sparrow actually is used first in the CIA documents. I must mention here that, and that's a message also to our own archives and to our own system, that we must declassify our records. You see, it's very easy to study Shastri because all the papers of Lyndon Johnson have been declassified. So, in fact, there's such a lot of material available on him from the Lyndon Johnson library, from the declassified records of the CIA, from the records of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, than we have our own things. Even Vijay Lakshmi Pandit used to call him the Little Sparrow. So, maybe, I don't know which preceded. I don't know whether he was called Little Sparrow first by Pandit or in the declassified papers of the CIA, but that's something which he was called upon. What was your question? I'm sorry, I've forgotten the question.
The question was, given personalities with very strong ideas like Morarji Desai, etc.
Yeah. My own feeling is, you see, that the All India Chief Ministers Conference used to play a very important role. Remember that most chief ministers were Congress chief ministers at that time. And so the Congress chief ministers also and the Congress parties in the states, that also had a major influence in deciding who it would be. I think his ability to conciliate, and especially the role that he had vis-a-vis Hindi and English, the Official Languages Act, which meant that all the non-Hindi speaking states were more inclined towards him than towards Morarji Desai, who was very rigid. Morarji Desai was the only serious contender to my mind. Gulzarilal Nanda was not a contender in that sense because he did not represent any particular philosophy. He was a stopgap arrangement, good person, but beyond that. So Morarji Desai was a very serious contender. But the problems with Morarji Desai were that he was, one, very, very rigid. So rigid about the Hindi language, because when this entire discussion on the Official Languages Act was happening, Jagjeevan Ram and Sampurnanand and Morarji Desai, to some extent D.P. Mishra, these were the people who were very, very strong insofar as saying that Hindi should be the sole and the exclusive language of the country. Whereas all the others, including, chief ministers from Bihar, Maharashtra, all the South, they were much happier with this consensus. So I think when the larger meeting was being held, a lot more people felt that it was easier to work with Shastri than to work with him. And let's not forget Kamraj. Kamraj and the syndicate, which included Atulya Ghosh, and Nijlingappa, and Hanumantaiah. So all these were people who were very keen that there should be a consensus man at the helm of affairs. The fact that he had already become minister without portfolio, I think that also helped. So this is how he was able to move in. And well, in retrospect, one can also say that support from Mrs. Gandhi. The other fact was that you see K.D. Malviya and Menon, they were no longer very important. In fact, their importance is also the reflected glory of Nehru. And in fact, after the 62 war, the entire Nehruvian model had also collapsed because we were not really non-aligned after 62 because we took a lot of support from America, both in terms of arms and munitions and also in terms of PL-480, in terms of our food aid and everything.
And you said Menon being Krishna Menon, of course, was
Yes.
discredited during the Indo-China war. You say there was no one strongly opposed to him, which sounds a little less about people who passionately believed in him as a man for the job rather than someone they had least objection to. And reading all the material, did you feel that was Shastri himself not ambitious?
He was ambitious, but as I said, his ambition was within the concept of dharma. You see, we must bring in the whole element of dharma here. You see, dharma is what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. I mean, your ambition, if your ambition is not within the confines of dharma, then there is something wrong about it. But if you are a politician and you are fighting election and you want to win, there's nothing wrong with it. So that is what I learned from Shastri, that you must aspire. You must try to do whatever is best for you, but it has to be within the norms of dharma. You don't cross a certain Lakshman Rekha.
Which I felt you sort of suggest that Morarji Desai crosses vis-a-vis Indira Gandhi after Nehru dies. And Shastri actually, even though Indira Gandhi was not necessarily the most cooperative cabinet member for him.
There are two aspects. One is, before he became the prime minister. And second is that after he became the prime minister, he just ignored her. Because there were many statements which he made which were not very conducive to the cabinet form of government. But he decided to just ignore her. So I think one of the great qualities of Shastri was also to understand when to react and when to not react. Because one of the things which I have also picked up in 36 years of government service is that you cannot react at every little thing. There would be times when you'll have to say, all right, let it be. You must know where to draw the line. And I think if you do not learn how to draw that line, then you end up in fighting the wrong battles. Take, for example, the formation of BSF. You see, we had the Run of Kutch incident.
You might want to explain what happened at Run of Kutch for people who are not aware.
What happened Run of Kutch was, you see, that the boundaries of Kutch, because Kutch was always part of the Western Indian States Agency. So the border of the international border, there was the border of the Pakistan Sindh as in Pakistan, and whatever was part of the Western Indian States Agency of India, which included Kutch. When Pakistan tried to bring its incursions into Run of Kutch, at that point of time, the first line of defense was with the police and with the CRPF. And then when it was realized that as far as the Pakistan is concerned, they're bringing in their army to look at this border dispute. In 1956, Pakistan stopped having provinces. So in 1956, Pakistan had one unit West Pakistan, one unit East Pakistan. So Pakistan did not have state police forces defending its borders. It had its rangers. So it was a central command structure which was looking at the borders. Whereas in India, what was happening was that Gujarat border was Gujarat police, Rajasthan police, then Bengal, Assam, then Punjab, and Jammu Kashmir. Jammu Kashmir was actually being handled by Punjab police because Jammu Kashmir did not really have a very strong armed police at that. So incursions taking place in different parts of the country. As it is, it would first move from the state police to state home, then to Delhi, and then so very quick response. I mean, they realize that, just as Pakistan has its rangers, we must develop our rangers. So in the sense that quick to respond to situations, and that is how the BSF got made. So in the Run of Kutch battle, what happened was that, Harold Wilson wanted to arbitrate this thing. And Aayup Khan had his own thoughts. He felt that, let me see whether India would take the bait, whether India would fight back. Most importantly, he wanted to check whether he can use the Patton tanks of America in the operations against India, because Patton tanks had been given to be used against China. Because it's a very, again, an ironical part of history that whatever equipment was given to Pakistan to prevent the spread of communism was being used in India. And they also had their own notions about, Hindus not being able to fight back, So these were all the things which were there. So what, in fact, my book concludes that Pakistan drew the wrong lessons from the Run of Kutch, and we drew the right lessons from the Run of Kutch. And another very important thing was that, India never went to the Security Council. I mean, after the 1948 fiasco that we had, where we thought that because we are the wrong party, the world will come to our aid. I mean, by this time, Shastri realized that, going to the UNSC is no solution. we must fight our own battles. And therefore, we fought our own battle. And so we got our moral and semantic victory in the UN ceasefire also, as and when it happened, at the behest of Pakistan, not at the behest of India.
I want to obviously come back to Pakistan, but the other thing he's so remembered for is that resignation as a rail minister. Even now, every time there is a terrible tragedy like that, people bring up the exemplar of Lal Bahadur Shastri. And I wanted to ask you, have we drawn the right lessons from his resignation? I mean, what struck you about the tone of that resignation letter compared to, say, modern politicians and this sense of responsibility?
You see, one of the basic differences, as I told you, is that, you see, he had joined politics not for power, he had joined politics to serve. That's a major difference, because he started his career as a volunteer in the Servants of People's Society. So he was a full-timer for the Servants of People's Society till very late in his life. The moral compass was so strong, so he felt genuinely hurt, was genuinely affected when so many people died when he went to the spot, and he couldn't take it. So in fact, it was his third resignation from the railways. The first time had happened when something had happened at a railway station, and he didn't like the way the Prime Minister had reacted, so he wanted to resign, but that was too small an incident. Then the first incident took place again in, I think, August or September, and then followed by, so it was the third. He wanted to resign first time also. Second time, he actually decided to resign because he felt that as the helmsman, he must take responsibility. And I think that was an important aspect. That's still an aspect which great leaders must assume responsibility for when something wrong happens. You can't really hold the station master or the lineman responsible. They are the ones who are directly responsible. But there's obviously a failure of systems. So when there's a failure of systems, then the topmost political person ought to take the responsibility. Having said that, I will not comment on why it is not being taken. That is,
but I was going to say, who has since then?
The ecosystem is so different. I mean, the ecosystem of those times and the ecosystem of today is so very different. And that reflects in politics, it reflects in media, it reflects in our films, it reflects in our society, it reflects in so many things.
But even at that time, how did his colleagues regard this resignation?
Nobody was openly critical. Though when he resigned under the Kamraj plan, Jagjeevan Ram and the others did make some comments that, in the I used the Chinese checker, the carom board of politics. He's been used as a striker. There was some skepticism when he resigned under the Kamraj plan and it was legitimate also, because in the first place, he had not been asked to resign. So he opted to resign. But in this case, no, I have not come across any document where his resignation, anyone felt that there was anything malified or anything. Nobody felt that way, because also in 1956, he was not a strong contender of being the Prime Minister. It was only in post-1957, especially post-1962, that he became a serious contender. In 1954, when the list of probables was drawn up, he was not there. It's only when Willis Hangen and all, Willis, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Willis Hangen, and the CIA, when they started drawing up the list in the 60s, that is when his name becomes an important name as one of the people. That's also because by this time, G.B. Pant has died, who could have been a very possible, could have been there. And, of course, Rajendra Prasad retired as president. So these were some of the names that were under consideration at that point of time.
You write that he saw it as his responsibility to promote this concept that India was not just a conglomeration of religious and linguistic communities, but a single united nation of Indians. Today, the current government, with its talk about, one nation, one book, one nation, one language, and all of that, could also claim that is what they want to promote. But are their ideas of India similar?
I must take you back to 1915, 1916, 1917. When Mahatma Gandhi came back to India, he realized that the way the Congress is structured, annual meets in English language, he realized that is not the way you can get freedom. You cannot get freedom in that real sense. You might get some seats in the Imperial Council, and some Indians might get a position of importance. They could become members of the White. But real freedom will come only when people are talking in their own languages. And that is why the internal restructuring of Congress, as Sindh Congress, Kannada Congress, Bangla Congress, all these Maratha Congress, all this started happening. And that is an entirely different way of looking at India. And I often give the example of Punjab, Sindh, Gujarat, Maratha, Dradi, Dut, Kalabanga. I think this is a very great national anthem, because this national anthem says that there is no contradiction between being a good Punjabi and being a good Indian, being a good Bengali and being a good Indian, being a good Gujarati and being a good Indian. So there is no such thing as, so in fact, Bharat and Punjab, Bharat and Sindh, they're not opposed to each other. They all make, although it's a question of nuance, and yet this nuance is so important. I think the national anthem of India is a very great national anthem. The simple reason that it says that there is no contradiction. You can be a Punjabi Hindu, you could be a Bengali Muslim, you could be a Christian from Goa, you could be anybody, and yet your loyalty, your commitment to India cannot be called to question. So I think that is a very important aspect. There is no privileged citizenship. I mean, just because you are a Hindu from the Hindu heartland does not make you more of a Hindu than Sandip Roy from Bengal or Sanjeev Chopra from here. India belongs equally to all of us. It could be anyone. So I think that's an important nuance. So it's a question of nuance rather than on what is. And again, one must realize it is not what is written or what is said. It is what is done which is more important. You see, how a thing is said, how a thing is done, when a thing is said, when a thing is done, makes a lot of difference. And this gives me back to, Shastri. It's a very, very interesting thing. He was in Nepal for his very first foreign visit. And somebody asked him, so how do you like Nepal? He said, I'm very disappointed. I said, why? He says, this was supposed to be my first foreign visit. And it doesn't look like a foreign visit, It looks so much. So, it is how you say a thing, when you say it. Now, this one statement endeared him to Nepal like anything. So I think it was this quality of being present here and now, of being able to cut jokes at his expense or at the, so I think this made him what he was.
Yeah, that cutting jokes at his expense is something I feel we've increasingly lost in public life, because even like now, I don't know whether any Indian leader will make the kind of comments he did after Aayup Khan of Pakistan pushes for war with India because he thinks this is a weak, dhoti-clad prime minister, not the England-educated Nehru like Aayup Khan himself. And instead of taking umbrage, Lal Bahadur Shastri sort of makes a joke about that, about his dhoti.
That is because he's so confident. I think, the ability to joke with oneself comes from confidence. So if you are not in a position to enjoy a cartoon about yourself, to enjoy a caricature about yourself, this reflects on you rather than on the person who's made a cartoon out of you, So it is your ability to look at yourself, all the warts and all the, wrinkles, and accept it as fine, which is what should be, which ought to be, but is not. So
were people though surprised when that somebody like Lal Bahadur Shastri, for the first time in India's recorded history, took the fight into the invaders' territory, into Pakistan?
Yes, I think there must have been an element of surprise, but I think it was very sensible of him to have done it, because if you go through the Operation Gibraltar, it failed. But when Operation Grand Slam started, which is when they wanted to move into, Pakistan was advancing very rapidly. Chenab had moved into only 12 kilometers to Akhnoor. That is the point when it was very clear that he must move in. And that is because he was being able to take good strategic advice from the armed forces. I mean, he had a very good equation with Air Marshal Arjun Singh, with J.N. Chaudhary. And you had a defense minister, Y.B. Chavan. I mean, we should never not give due credit to Y.B. Chavan. Y.B. Chavan was a master defense, in fact, the finest defense minister which India has had. So, in fact, Chavan records that it's a very big risk that we are taking. We're taking a very big risk of moving into that thing. And remember, this was also only a 4-day war. I mean, first they attacked us, second, third, you were deciding on whether to, move in. Third, we moved in. By 6th, 7th, 8th, it was over. 6th, 7th, Pakistan was moving to the UNSC, saying that please help us out, because we moved into Lahore, we moved into Barmer, we moved closer to Sialkot. We'd given them a decisive loss in Khemkaran and Asal Uttar. So, these are important aspects. And I think the transformation of the Indian Army from 1962 to 1965 is again a fantastic success story. And it happens because you are in a position to make partnerships. So I think the credit for the 65 war will go to Mr. Shastri, to Mr. Chavan, and to the brave soldiers, and to the leadership at that point of time.
And interestingly, since you mentioned pattern cakes, when the war is over, he gets to cut a pattern cake in the shape of a pattern tank. But while then the famous agreement in Tashkent, when he and Aayup Khan meet, now for us is overshadowed by the tragedy of his death. But do you think that agreement would have landed him in trouble? Because before Shastri dies, Vajpayee in India has opposed it. Even right before he dies, you're right, he talks to his own daughter, and the family says they aren't happy with it because India has agreed under international mediation to give up territory it had occupied, like the Haji Pir.
Sandeep, you are a media person, so you know how narratives are built, as well as I know how narratives are built. I think, that this was a major failure, and with all due respect to Kuldeep Nair, I think the way the Tashkent Agreement was projected, and it's a very interesting thing. Today, what happens is that in today's instance, everyone is claiming victory. And in Tashkent, the Pakistan press was saying that Aayup Khan has lost, and the Indian press was saying that Shastri has lost. It's a very difficult situation today. We say that we have won, and their general says that he's won a victory, so he's become a field marshal. So the fact is, you see, that we must understand that whenever there is a negotiation, what is the meaning of negotiation? Negotiation is the meaning of give and take. Now, you see, the ceasefire line, the accepted ceasefire line between India and Pakistan has been accepted from 1949, 1st January 1949, so as is where is. Now, on that as is where is basis, you see, the two things. I mean, if we say that, all right, we keep what we have and you keep what you have. Let's not forget that Cham and Jorian were in their occupation and they were 12 kilometers to Aknur. So if you want them to push back where they have moved in, then you have to go back to where you were, so you can't have the cake and eat it too. In fact, in 1973, a lot of criticism is made that Mrs. Gandhi gave back 93,000. If you've signed the Geneva Agreement on POWs, then you have to do this. You can't say that I will not do, but you will do what you will do for me. I think the narrative should have been twofold. One, that you see, Pakistan insisted on 1st September as the date of Indian aggression. India said, no, the date is 5th August, when Operation Gibraltar started. And finally, we got the UNSC to accept that, yes, the war was started by Pakistan on 5th of August. I think that was a major semantic and a major moral victory. And I would like to believe that if Shastri would have spoken from his heart on his arrival and narrated the entire sequence of events, the narrative would have changed. You see, just as when you look at the no confidence motions, the 3 no confidence motions that he has faced, he is attacked. It looks that he is vulnerable. When he gets back with his arguments, he demolishes all those arguments. Pakistan's objectives all throughout have been to prove this one nation theory, that in India, Hindus and Muslims can't live together. Right. It is the fact that this has been rejected most decisively by the people of this country. All the times when Pakistan has tried to create a wedge in the Indian people, that please look at yourself as Indian Hindus or as Indian Muslims or as Indian Bengalis or as Indian Punjabis. It is this narrative which is failed. And I think that is the greatest strength of our country. And that is the greatest tribute to our country.
And I felt reading the book that even Aayup Khan, who has a fairly low, dismissive opinion perhaps of Lal Bahadur Shastri, probably genuinely felt something at the end of Tashkent when he chooses to be a pallbearer for the Indian Prime Minister.
You see, certainly I think in Pakistan, the real devil in the piece is Bhutto. Imagine the counterfactual of history. If Mujibur Rahman had been allowed to become the Prime Minister of Pakistan, which he ought to have been, because he had more seats, than this one. So this Bhutto's distortion of all institutions. And then imagine the Foreign Minister coming and giving orders to the Commander-in-Chief, and that broke the morale of the Pakistan Army. General Musa, who was the Commander-in-Chief, was not being consulted by Aayup Khan. And then you see that Malik, who was their commander, he was replaced by Yahya Khan. So Pakistan Army also had its own problems, also had its own scenes. Aayup Khan had a genuine feeling of respect for Shastri, which I think got strengthened by the performance of the Indian Army, because the Indian Army had not performed so well. If Operation Gibraltar had not failed, if Operation Grand Slam had not failed, maybe his impression would have been different. But Mr. Bhutto had a very different game plan altogether. And I think the main thorn in the relationship between India and Pakistan for a very long time has been the ideology of Bhutto.
I was not going to ask you this question, but you brought up the counterfactual of what if Mujibur Rahman had been allowed to become Prime Minister. So I will ask you the counterfactual what if question that historians hate, which is, what if Shastri had lived? How do you think India would have been different?
What would have, it's because I'm not a journalist. I'm a bureaucrat turned historian. But I'll still say one thing. I'll only quote from what Shastri had said. Shastri had said that if his reign is longer, then he would be succeeded by Y.B. Chauhan and not Indira Gandhi. And he said that if I die early, then I'll be succeeded by Indira Gandhi. Now, if Y.B. Chauhan had been his successor, India would have had a very, very different trajectory. We don't know what that trajectory would have been, but certainly some of the very, very populist measures which happened in the late 60s and early 70s, nationalization of banks, the abolition of privy purses, all these things that may not have happened. And then that counterfactual of Mujibur Rahman also having become the Prime Minister of Pakistan and Y.B. Chauhan having become the Prime Minister of India, now we're talking about a very different we lead a very long conversation with that.
And weird quirks of timing, as you say, Pant has died by the Nehru had died 2 years earlier or had given up, it would have been very different.
No, but if Nehru had died, before 62, his stature in world history would have been made, because the fact is that Nehru would be remembered amongst other things for the 62 debate.
Right. But even Shastri, given the very positive aspects that you bring out about him, why do you also say that during his prime ministership, when his picture would appear in those newsreels we used to see in cinemas, sometimes people would jeer at him? Was he not popular?
No, initially, you see, it was just in the first 1 or 2 months because people were so used to seeing a very tall leader and then, replaced by Shastri. There are some instances which mention to this, but I think by the time the 65 what happened or even earlier, you see, his stature was growing very sharply. I mean, remember also that there was the English-speaking press, the mainstream press, which was so enamored by Mr. Nehru. When you have been in power for such a long time, from 47 to this one, and you've been in public life from 1930, like 1929, And remember also that that Shastri was never opposed to Nehru. They had a very nice relationship. It was a mentor-mentee relationship to a very large extent. There was a lot of respect which Shastri had for Nehru. And yet there were areas in which he would not agree with Mr. Nehru. But I think that's a trait which he had picked up very early in his childhood, that if you don't like something, unless it is so strong, and that happened when his mama, broke the promise and killed the partridge, which had flown away. And he said, you get it back. He says, but you will kill it. He says, no, I won't kill it. But he made, shorba out of it, and then he refused to eat. But unless it crossed that line, he would, So in fact, you see, Shastri was very upset when Kaul was given the charge of the 4th Corps in 62. But he kept quiet at that time. But when it came to Krishna Menon's ouster, he was very clear that no, it must be done.
Finally, I'd say in this sort of very polarized polity that we live in now, one would easily say we need these great conciliators even more. But do you honestly think there is room for such a humble, unassuming man like him in politics today? Would he have been successful today? I mean, he had a hard childhood. You write about how as a couple, they just had 3 sets of clothes. One they wore, second was for the wash, and third was kept in rivers. But he never talked about, he never used that as his electoral stump speech.
Yeah. You see, there are 2 things here. One is, you see that at that time, there was poverty in India was 82% in 1947 and literacy was 12%. Therefore, a lot of things which were the norm in those days are not the norm now. I mean, today, if you were to say that you have only 3 sets of clothes, like some of the pretensions which some of our politicians do, by wearing, it's not, today, the salaries that we have, today, the lifestyles that we have, today, the earnings that we have, today, the average income in this country is such that certainly all of us are beyond that. Now, you don't have to wear poverty on your sleeve. See, 1971, just about 7 to 8% of our country was urban. So 92% of the country was rural. Our parliamentary constituencies are shaped by that narrative. So only 8% of our MPs come from urban areas. 92% come from rural areas. So once these 92% people are coming from rural areas, they bring with them a particular mindset. Anecdotally, I would feel that India is now 30 to 35% urban. That's the least. It could even be 40%. So my own feeling is that once more and more MPs come from urban areas, more young people or not so young people, or certainly people who are not in their late 70s or early 80s, and who've made a good success of their professional lives, may start entering politics and change it. My daughter tells me it's wishful thinking, everyone says it, is that Indian politics will change and is changing very rapidly, is changing more than is being captured on the camera, more than is being captured even by erudite journalists like you. So I think there's a groundswell of change that's happening, which I find when I talk to young people.
So leave us with something that you take away from all this time you spent looking at Lal Bahadur Shastri's life, because for many people who didn't know enough about him, it's defined by, they remember Tashkent, they remember the railways resignation, they remember incidents like that.
Humility is the best embellishment. It is something which I have started. I mean, a lot of people say that you now say Sheelam Param Bhushanam because you've retired. So there's nothing else that you could except be humble after retirement. But yes, I seriously feel that, Sheelam Param Bhushanam, that humility is the best embellishment. And being humble does not mean that you don't have to be competent. You have to be humble while you are fully competent. So I think these two aphorisms which are there, yoga, karma, kaushalam, that is, your performance has to be number one. A true yoga is actually excellence in your karma. And then there is Sheelam Param Bhushanam. So I think these two things which are there in the academy, which I saw all the time in my life. All my letterhead would always have, yoga, karma, sukha. And I spoke about it 20 years ago when I had to give some valedictory or something. But, having seen his work, for instance, the Congress Agrarian Commission report is yoga, karma, sukha. There's no better report on agrarian reforms could have been written in 1935. And with this excellence, if you can remain humble, with this excellence, the quest of excellence and humility in personal life, excellence in public sphere, humility in personal life, I do not claim to have those qualities at all. I think, but that is something which if we can even get a slight measure of this, we would be better as individuals, better as communities, and certainly much better as a nation.
Sanjeev Chopra, thank you so much for spending this time with us, talking about Lal Bahadur Shastri and so much more.
Thank you, Sandeep.
Sanjeev Chopra, superannuated as the director of the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy of Administration in Mussoorie after serving for 36 years in the Indian Administrative Service. He's the author of The Great Conciliator, Lal Bahadur Shastri, and the Transformation of India. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. Thanks for listening. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.